What we're going to talk about today is my note-taking system that I use for my classes. It's a little more than a note-taking system. It actually serves as the toolbox, as I like to say. This is your toolkit for dissecting and analyzing literature. All of our skills that we're going to do in literary analysis and in attentive reading or active reading. What I try to teach, the main skill that I try to teach in my literature and writing classes is active analysis. Most students you can go to school and you can do what teachers in the curriculum tell you to do, and you can get a good grade. However, if you are only doing what you are told rather than learning how to achieve the analysis on your own, you're only really doing about half of the work that you need to do. So what you need to be able to do is, given any situation, ask the right questions, think clearly and effectively about the information that you're given in any given situation, and analyze a work of art or a work of literature. Literacy is about more than just reading and summarizing. Does that make sense to everybody? Raise your hand if that makes sense. The distinction between active and passive. Please raise your hand. If you are following. Okay. I think there's some people who maybe. All right. Great. So first things first, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go to a Google Doc that I have. In all of my classes, we have a shared Google document that we all use together. And this would be where you would share your homework that you'll do between classes. There's always homework. There's always a writing component and a reading component. So we're always going to be reading a book or a selection of short stories, maybe some poems. I know a lot of kids cringe at the idea of doing poetry, but I really enjoy doing a poetry unit. I find poetry to be really effective, but for today we're going to talk about The Telltale Heart, which is like one of the most famous American short stories by a fair shake. And even if you haven't read it, you may be familiar with the name. And so we're going to use The Telltale Heart to explore and for me to explain my note-taking system. So my note-taking system is called Spicy, which is it's an unfortunate name, but it is the only acronym that works with these letters, and these are the 6 components that I want students to be able to think about in any given situation with a particular work of art or work of literature. You can use Spicy to analyze anything made by human beings. This can apply to a book, a poem, short story, sculpture, painting, candy bar wrapper, McDonald's advertisement, ancient pottery from ancient Greece. If you apply these 6 concepts to anything that you find, this can be your toolkit that you apply. If you can master this and get good at analyzing things based on these, then almost any object or work by a human being that you run into, you can at least start to analyze it. You may not get complete analysis, and you may not necessarily completely understand it, but this will at least get you started. These 6 things you can find in any work of art. But let's think about, it's kind of easier if you think about it in terms of stories. Can anybody tell me, go ahead and type in chat, or you can unmute too and just say it. What's something that you think can be found in any story? Plot is one of them. Setting is another. Character is another. So let's actually pause there because these two groups kind of split into two. Climax is good, but not every story has a climax, and climax is actually a portion of plot, but that's a good guess. So I call these the little peppers. These you want to keep track of. Setting plot and character you want to keep track of entirely while you're reading. So throughout the whole reading process, this will change and evolve as the plot moves along, as the characters grow and change in response to events in the story. Sometimes the setting changes. In all these cases, you want to monitor these for note-taking purposes. So you keep track of the little peppers as you move along. Now these three, I call the big peppers. These three are ones that you want to do at the beginning. You want to keep track of these at the beginning, and you don't necessarily need to monitor these the whole time you're reading a novel, say. If you're looking at a statue or a building, if you're thinking about architecture, then these are actually sometimes the most important part, because architecture doesn't have a lot of setting, plot, and character, although you, as we'll find out, you can find setting, plot, and character even in architecture. But even the absence of a plot can be, that's the plot, is that there is no plot. But anyway, I get ahead of myself. What are some big conceptual parts? These are within the story, and these three are outside of the story, or they're part of the makeup of the story itself. What's something else that every work of art or every story has? Let me give you a hint here. I walked into the room with a smile on my face. Good, that's not bad, Ethan. I don't think everyone has suspense or action, but you're kind of getting into it. Suspense, I walked in the room with a smile on my face. Smiling, I walked into the room. I entered the room with happiness on my feet, moving. What's the difference between these three sentences? Starting with S. Structure is pretty close. Structure is a part of style. And every work of art, every piece of literature has a different style. They have a different way in which something is told. You can say the same thing in many different ways. And the difference in the way that you say it influences the meaning that you're trying to convey. You could have like Henry David Thoreau, who is one of the most flowery and dramatic and emotional kind of writers, or you can have Ernest Hemingway, who kind of purposefully goes out of his way to make things as straightforward and simplistic as possible in order to increase the impact of his words. You could, Hemingway and Thoreau could be talking about the same topic and you would barely know because the style would be so different. This one, this P, is actually three words, three short words. Point of view, very good. Who knows the three different numbers associated with point of view? First, second, and third. I, you, and he, she, it, right? But it's certainly more complicated than that. Think about a painting, for example. The point of view of a painting is extremely important. You know, where is the viewer? What are they looking at? The point of view is extremely important for writing as well. And we'll get to that in just a second about why that's important. All right, and then the final one is a little bit trickier. It's kind of all by itself. So I want to make, let me make an example of why this is important. So who has read Harry Potter? Don't even bother raising your hand. I guess raise your hand if you don't know Harry Potter or have never heard of Harry Potter before. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought here. So imagine that J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, she calls a news conference, and all the cameras are there. You know, it's on CNN. You got the Chiron. J.K. Rowling declares, you know, calls for surprise news conference, and she gets up, and the cameras are flashing, and she goes up behind the podium, and she gets up behind the podium, and she says, "Magic is real. I am a wizard, and you'll never see me again." And she waves her wand, and she goes Avada Kedavra, and she actually kills somebody in the front row, and everybody's horrified, and then she disappears, and everybody's going crazy. What effect would that have on reading Harry Potter in the future? If it was clear that J.K. Rowling was a wizard, we had never seen magic before. J.K. Rowling shows us that she's a wizard, and then she disappears and actually kills somebody, and scientists are like, we have no idea how she did that. We have no idea how this person died. It appears that they were killed by magic. How would that change our understanding of the Harry Potter series if J.K. Rowling is proven to be Voldemort? Bingo. Very good. Think about how much that would change. We would think, like, is this real? Is Harry Potter nonfiction after all? Did all of this stuff happen? Was there really a boy who lived in a Voldemort, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Or is magic real, but she made this all up? Or is she just trying to confuse us? The story around the story is very important. Now, you can basically understand stories without the context, but if you take the context out completely, you're not entirely understanding what the meaning the author might be trying to convey. And that's really what we come down to. This is a bit of, when you add all of these things together, you get a word, a simple 5 letters, not a math teacher. We get a 5-letter word that we're trying to figure out. What is the T word that we're trying to come up with by looking at these components? Can anybody guess? This is for the literature section here. We're going to use these and this final T word to work on the writing section, the writing component of the class, where we'll be focusing on another T word. Very good, Elizabeth. Yes. Theme. Theme is the point that the author is trying to make. You can have multiple themes in a work of art, but in general, theme is what we're trying to identify. And once we identify, like, oh, based on the plot and how the characters interact with each other, I think the author is trying to say that ice cream is dangerous, should be outlawed. That's what the author's point was in this short story, just the dangers of ice cream. We can tell because in the story, everybody gets addicted to ice cream and society collapses, and the characters cry because they wish that ice cream had never been invented. Now, the author isn't saying explicitly, the author doesn't say literally that ice cream is dangerous and should be outlawed, but within the story, we see the dangerous effects of ice cream and how harmful it can be. And so we know that they would agree with this sentence based on the evidence that we see. Does everybody follow me? You don't need to respond necessarily, but maybe raising of hands, why we want to focus on theme. Okay. Now, having identified a potential theme, what would we then do in terms of writing? Another TH word here. Anybody know what this TH word is? This one has 6 letters. Think, ooh, I like that. That's not what I'm going for, but ultimately that's the skill that we're trying to get. That's the active reading part of it. That's true. but when we work with theme, we want to be able to create one of these. It actually starts with the same 3 letters. Ooh, good guess. Thesis is what we're going for. Thesis theory is a good one. That's more scientific reasoning. That's more experimentation. So we want to identify what we think to be a theme, and then we want to use the evidence to support a thesis that we're making against the theme. And so with these 2 things, theme and thesis, we're able to analyze pretty much any work of art and then discuss it at length. These are the skills that I work to develop in my classes. With these skills, you can use it in any subject that you have to do writing about. Anytime you want to make a point, anytime you want to do some analysis, you gather evidence, you identify some sort of useful, general theory or theme in terms of literature, and then you write about it using a thesis being an arguable point. Now, today we're not going to dig into the writing component of it too much. We're going to talk about the literary analysis, but these are the 2 sides of the curriculum that I like to do. Now, before we dig into Telltale Heart, does anybody have any questions about this? Go ahead and jump into the chat, or you can unmute and ask questions out loud if you have any questions here before we move on. Okay. So, for those of you who did or have read the Telltale Heart before, what we're going to do is we're going to use SPCSPC to kind of pull it apart a little bit and see what the individual components are. The thing about these components is that they all answer questions. The author and the reader are both kind of asking questions, or the reader especially is asking questions about the story. So the setting that is chosen by the author is an answer to 2 questions in particular. What 2 questions does setting answer? Very basic questions, fundamental questions. Where and when does the story take place? Very important. We won't get too much into it, but like if we think about a fantasy story, generally a fantasy story is going to be in a castle or a cave or a field or a forest, something fairly basic. And if you had a story a fantasy story, you've got a guy with a sword and he's fighting a dragon, then if it's taking place in a castle, how important is setting if a story about a knight and a dragon takes place in a castle? Well, setting is not all that important. Clearly, the setting is not doing very much in terms of the story. Then we may be focusing more on character or style if the fantasy story is in a castle. But if you've got a knight in a suit of armor fighting a dragon in a submarine, then setting becomes much more important. It's kind of like that J.K. Rowling thing, where sometimes you can tell very easily which part of the story is most important to the purpose of the story. If the story is taking place on a submarine, if a dragon's on a submarine, the setting is extraordinarily important. It would constrict every single part of the story, and basically the whole thing is about what would happen if a dragon was on a submarine. What questions does plot answer? What happens? And plot obviously is fairly straightforward. Plot is the one that you're going to keep track of most frequently when you're taking notes for me, because after you get started for a while, it becomes the only thing that changes frequently. You still want to keep track of setting and character and keep an eye out for these, but most of it happens at the very beginning. We'll get more into plot later. I think most everybody kind of intuitively understands how plot is important for a story. But not every story has a plot. We may read some stories that don't have a very clear plot, in fact, or stories in which the plot is not clear until the very end, like To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. Character obviously answers what question? Who? And this one is so important because humans are very, very selfish. We're very self-centered, and we really like things that are about us. Ansel Adams is a famous landscape photographer. He creates these images of nature, and he once got a criticism like, why don't you put more people in your photographs? Everything's always about nature. Putting a person in there would be really nice. It'd be nice to see the scale. How big is this piece of nature? And Ansel Adams said, no, I can't do that. If I do that, then all of the attention will go to the human being, because human beings, like, if you add a human being, it's the thing we instantly become fascinated with. It doesn't matter what the circumstances, we tend to sympathize with the people. So this is usually one of the most important components of what an author is trying to do. So when it answers who, we also have a series of questions that we want to ask about who, because if you just go like Harry Potter, that's not very helpful. So you want to add some elaborating questions for the who part. So like, how are they related? What do they want? What are their conflicts in getting what they want? And this is usually more helpful to elaborate on to understand what the author is trying to do. What question does style answer? Someone said it already, but how? How is the story told? And as we showed, change in style can truly change the feeling of a story completely. Now, point of view is a little trickier. What question is point of view trying to answer in the story, generally speaking? Why? I would say context is a little bit more why, or really theme is kind of the ultimate why question. From where is a very good way of putting that, I think. The way that I put this is, how much information is the reader going to get? Change in point of view changes how much information we have. If you say, I entered the room and saw my friend pouring a glass of water, that's very different from Bill entered the room and saw his friend pouring a glass of water, but he didn't know the water was poisoned. Very different situation, right? If we have first person, Bill doesn't know, so that changes things completely. If we are in third person, however, we can know everything. The author can decide to tell us that the water is poisoned, or he can wait to tell us that the water is poisoned. It could tell it from both of them. Bill entered the room and saw Gary. Gary smiled, pouring a glass of water because Bill didn't know the water was poisoned. Very different story when we're involving all of the characters. And then finally, context. What questions does context answer? Why is a good way of looking at it. I would also say that it's, in a way, it's basically the 5W and 1H, the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the story itself. It's kind of the story of the story. And there are people who would argue that you actually shouldn't consider this too much when you're reading a story, or that the meaning of a story doesn't require this. But as a history teacher, I think it's important to know these things. So there's analysis that you can do without the context, and then there's analysis that you can do with the context. So I like to incorporate both components. So, I mean, if you find a poem on the ground and you don't know who wrote it, you can still get meaning out of it, 100%. In fact, you could entirely get meaning out of a poem without the context. But I find that context is a wonderful tool for understanding the significance of a work of art in broader terms. So it's almost two different kinds of analysis. Context is almost a thing all by itself. Who wrote it? Where did they write it? Why did they write it? When did they write it? What other stories are there that are similar to this one? So genre kind of fits within context. Genre kind of is in between both style and context in my mind. Okay, so let's apply this to, let's see how much time we got left here. Okay, great. So we'll apply this to Telltale Heart. What's the setting of a Telltale Heart? Okay, it's a house. That's true. It's in the boarding house. That actually, a little bit more specificity there makes a difference, because if you don't know what a boarding house is, it might not make sense. Why does this guy live with this old man? A boarding house is more of an old-fashioned style where maybe a person who is poor or down on their luck would stay in someone's house. It's kind of like an apartment in a way. Temporary, it's like renting a space. There's less housing back then. There's a boarding house, and it's in the mid-19th century. The plot, not a lot of plot in this one. A crazy man kills a man and goes crazy. Not very helpful. If you only look at the plot of The Telltale Heart, then what you're really getting is just a crazy man doing a crazy bad thing, to put it simply. The characters are, can anybody list the characters? There's not that many. We got the narrator. The narrator, the old man. The police officers. The unseen neighbors. And there's one more that people usually miss. The heart. The heart maybe doesn't exist, because arguably the heart at the end of the story is the narrator's own heart that is beating so quickly that he can hear it in his own head, arguably. But there's one more. He's actually this hidden character is very important in my mind, to appreciating the story, and you can find them in the very first line of the story. Let me see if I can pull that up here. Very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? Why will you say that I am mad? You is exactly right. There is a hidden listener. It's hidden right at the very beginning. I don't believe it shows up. I don't think you show up. Here we go. If you think me mad, you think, whoever it is thinks that the narrator is mad. And this kind of adds an element of a connective element, where we're listening to this guy's story. So we know at the end that he goes to prison, or at least he's certainly arrested, or something along those lines. So where are we hearing this story? To whom is he telling this story? Well, we could be lawyers who are listening to his confession, police officers, or we might be in the jail cell with him. In any case, it's our responsibility to listen because he's talking to us. I like to think that we're in the insane asylum together. That's the one that I like. I find that one to be a little bit more creepy. How would you characterize the style of the story? Gothic horror. Very, very emotional. I like to say purple. It's very purple prose. It's, I would say, claustrophobic. We don't want to be in this guy's head. It's not a very long story, but almost instantly we feel uncomfortable sharing the same mental space as this guy telling the story. He makes it very clear that the way he sees the world is not the way that most people see the world. The point of view is first person, and that's one of the ways. So now we can actually build to, we can see where the theme is coming in, because if we're claustrophobic in style, we feel trapped with this guy. We also have the fact that there's this unseen narrator. So we are put into the same space as the guy. He's talking to us, and we also have to get in his head. So it's almost like we're talking to ourselves. So the tightness, the energy, the use of perspective, the point of view of the first person with this kind of implied you that he's talking to, all of this works together to create a sense of madness. The theme being that being mad is unpleasant, I would say. It's pretty straightforward. And then finally, context. This is where I always say, go read the Wikipedia first before you start reading the short story or you read the book. Edgar Allan Poe. He was one of the first mystery and first horror writers in the style that we think about it. So he, not like alone, but he's kind of responsible for he's the godfather of horror and mystery. One of the, like, they don't always fit exactly into those, but like this one, for example, it's a horror story and a mystery story. We wouldn't have most of our modern, he's the guy who kind of invents those. So knowing that it's from the he's American, again, mid 19th century, that puts it in a very different world than our own. So knowing that we're in a time like pretty much just before the Industrial Revolution, it's actually the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that changes the technology that's present, that changes what we can expect as readers as well. Also, he was an alcoholic who suffered from depression and his own kind of madness. So knowing that Poe himself was a bit mad, just like the narrator in The Telltale Heart, also gives us an interesting insight into our reading of it. And from here, we might be able to then create a thesis, make an argument, so that we have the theme here. Before we go, why doesn't everybody try to come up with a theme? The trick for a theme, so what students might often do is they might say something like madness. Madness is not a theme, though. Madness is a topic. The difference between a topic and a theme is that a theme is a complete sentence. So since we know one of the topics of the story is madness, then what is a complete sentence that you can make about this story based on all this evidence that is true that the author seems to think about madness? Oh, Anson coming up with a controversial take here. He actually hears the heart. The vulture eye is actually intending to be cruel and deserves to be destroyed. You'd have to support that one. You'd have to find some evidence to support why the guy's not mad. Anybody else have a theme? What is a complete sentence that you could do about madness here? Go ahead and type it into the chat. I want to get a couple more. I want to see a couple more people come up with one before we go. Madness cannot be hidden. Yeah, your madness will give you away. I like that. Sins will find you. No matter what. There's many possible. This one's pretty straightforward. I don't think, honestly, in this story, I don't think there's a lot of theme. I don't think that Poe is really trying to say a lot. I think he's just trying to creep you out. Like something like being inside a person, inside the mind of a mad person would be creepy. Like, I honestly think that's about it for the themes for this story. It's not thematically rich. It's stylistically rich, but maybe not too much in terms of theme. But we can still make arguments. We can talk about how the author uses these spicy characteristics to build the story. So before we go, and again, I'll give Janet this story, this video, and you can take a look at this if you want to, but does anybody have any questions?